Hey guys, Youngblood with you, and today we're going to do a should you buy video on the newly revealed Citizen Con ship, the Aegis Sabre. Now, like a lot of concept sales, we don't have a ton of final information about the ship, but the information that we have in place, we'll kind of hope to compare it to a bit, some of the ships that we can fly now, and kind of try and make a decision on who this might be the right ship for. Now, missing out on some information that might border on the critical, like shield and power plant sizes, makes it a tough comparison. However, we have the description of what this ship should be, and CIG's done a pretty good job of making ships match those expectations so far, so I think that's going to end up helping out. If you haven't seen the ship yet or read the description, the Sabre is basically a next-level fighter designed to deal with the Vanduul Stinger, which is a heavy fighter. The description goes on to talk about how it is yet to have been picked up by the UEE as far as their design for that next level fighter. But in the meantime, they've decided to release these as a sale for civilian operators. Now, I think if we combine the lore that we've read so far, and then some of the hints that CIG's gone on to release, we can probably assume that this was up against the Anvil F8 Lightning to be chosen for the government contract. Knowing that the F8 is going to be in Squadron 42, then we can probably then say that the F8 was chosen by the government, and then this is probably not selected for the military in that contract. We don't really know enough about the F8 to do a fair comparison about the two, but we can put this ship up against a couple that are in the current game, and ships that we can currently fly, and it's likely to go ahead and compete with, and that in my mind is probably going to be the Super Hornet and the Gladius. Now, the Sabre is the longest of these three ships, at 26 meters long, and probably falls in the middle ground as far as weight, weight's concerned, at 18,000 kilograms. As far as the speed is concerned, we obviously don't know that yet, but when we look at it, and we can say the Gladius runs at 240 meters per second with 16,000 weight, with two TR2 engines, I would assume that the Sabre is going to probably run about 250, maybe 260, when you consider that it's really only 2,000 heavier and it's running two TR3 engines. Now, maneuverability is a tricky thing to assume as well. You know, the Gladius comes with 8 TR1 thrusters and is one of the more agile ships in the game. I think that it pretty clearly states that you can't just look at the numbers on that stat page to make assumptions about the maneuverability, because things like the placement of thrusters can end up having a big impact. You know, take the Super Hornet, for example. It's got 8 size 2 thrusters, and we all know that thing's hardly a ballerina in combat. The Sabre is stated to be built to match the Stinger in speed and turning, so agility has to be very high. And based on the combination of the description and the stats, I think it's probably going to be the most nimble of the three ships, or at least very similar to the Gladius in the end. The overall purpose of the ship is really to combine the firepower and agility. Now, the stats and the price both verify that it should outdo the Gladius in both of these categories. Price isn't really going to be the end-all, be-all of ship performance, but it can certainly at least be an indicator that we need to consider. The Gladius is sold for $90 right now, and the Sabre in concept is being sold at $170, so that's almost double in price. Add to that the fact that the Gladius is considered somewhat outdated, and this seems to be a direct upgrade to the Gladius platform. So if we're saying that, we really need to spend a bit more time comparing the Super Hornet and the Sabre then, since I think they're going to be more direct competitors in different forms. Now, I still get that the Super Hornet is going to be the brawler, and honestly, at this point, I think it would be anyone would really have a hard time taking that role from the Super Hornet. You know, the Hornet's slow, it has good shields, it's got good armor that's been proven in Arena Commander, and has a bunch of turreted weapons that work well for a slower, less agile ship, helping it deal with the more nimble targets. The Super Hornet equips 6 total weapons, including some size 4s, and that's something that the Sabre really can't match. You know, the new Sabre comes with 2 size 3 fixed weapons and 2 size 3 gimbaled weapons, so the Sabre comes in with less weaponry overall, though it is worth noting that with the fixed weapons could be dropped size to put on gimbals if you prefer just a full gimbaled setup. Another perk to the Sabre is that it kind of carries over some of those lessons that we've learned from the Vanguard into its design, which means that it also comes with some redundancies in the systems. We see that it has 4 shieldings and 3 power plants, so you may be able to knock down its effectiveness in those areas piece by piece, but it's harder to just eliminate them outright with a couple of good shots. I don't think that this becomes the, quote-unquote, able to limp back to base type of platform that the Vanguard's been sold as, but I think that it does help to counteract that a little bit, and it kind of counteracts some of the less armoring and shielding that something like a Super Hornet may have that's going to trump it in those regards. Now, another thing running in the Super Hornet's favor is that it does have a secondary seat for another gunner. Now, I think it's actually a benefit to some, but it's probably a detriment to some of you as well. The Super Hornet's extremely effective as is, with just the pilot and the ball turret slave to the pilot's aim. However, if you put a dedicated gunner in there, you're able to target other ships that you wouldn't be able to do while you're flying. And it gets a lot of added benefit in that regard. Now, that benefit only comes if you've got another person or another NPC that can sit in that slot. The Sabre gets all of its max ability with just one player and relies on the agility of the ship to really bring all its weapons on target. Now, I think at this point, choosing between the Super Hornet and the Sabre is a pretty even battle that kind of depends on your overall playstyle. If you prefer that fast and agile ship to do your damage and to get you out of trouble, then the Sabre is probably your clear choice. However, if you prefer a heavy platform capable of taking as much damage as it's capable of dealing, then the Super Hornet wins that battle for you. Now, I personally think that the Sabre is kind of finding that jack-of-all-trades spot in the fighter category. If you think about the arms rates, a scythe is really kind of built to be effective and can deal damage to a Hornet because it can stay out of the trouble areas for the Hornet. The UEE brings the tankier Super Hornet to deal with that scythe with all its gimbaled weapons and improved shielding to withstand those attacks. The Vandal will have the glaive, which sort of brings the extra firepower while retaining the agility to deal with the Super Hornet. The Stinger is sort of like the glaive in that it's a larger, heavier fighter, and when when you really try and counter that, you're talking about countering ships with an opposite. So if you're talking about countering the Stinger, something like the Sabre might fit in there really nicely. It's got the agility to overwhelm slower and tankier targets and match the more nimble ones, while having the firepower to overwhelm the more agile targets and match the heavier ones. It's really kind of an interesting dynamic, and I tend to prefer the balance over just raw power. I think that's kind of a big statement for a ship that's just entered concept and, really just balance phases. But I think it's really probably finding a sweet spot to kind of sit in that a lot of people are going to end up appreciating. As far as the design of the ship goes, I think it's really pretty awesome, but that's really more in the eye of the beholder. I've heard some people echoing the types of sentiments that I've heard before when they were talking about the Vanguard, and they didn't really care for that winged look of spaceship. Now, I like that the weapons tend to be closer to the center line, helping to keep them, covered and probably less likely to be blown off in combat like we see with some other ships, i.e. the Hornet. And the weapons that are overhanging the front canopy also should look really great while in the cockpit. However, it could end up creating slight visibility issues depending on where you actually sit in that cockpit. The missile platform is under the belly of the ship, and it appears to flip out for deployment, helping to keep them covered during non-use. And it also just makes a nice look. And outside of that, I've also been a fan of twin engine looks, not only aesthetically, but also for the redundancy purposes. It gives you a little bit more something to fall back on. I think when it comes to the should you buy portion, this ship is probably going to be great. And I think what you get in return is probably fairly priced. Now, I would have preferred to see it match up with the Super Hornet as opposed to being more expensive, but they really aren't that far off from each other when you're talking about just the bottom dollar line. I think I'll probably end up upgrading my Gladius to the Sabre, as I'd prefer a ship that I think is going to fly similarly, but also brings that extra firepower and is less outdated. One last thing to consider that Sir Lev Eris suggested on Reddit that I thought was a great point. So there's going to be a link to that in the description, basically pointing you back to his post, is that if you're tight on money right now but are certain that you want a ship that's on limited sale, you can take advantage of the new CCU pass to really buy or upgrade to the Sabre from one of the ships that's permanently in place. So, for example, you can always upgrade to a Freelancer DUR. It's always available in the in the sales shop. So you could technically then buy an upgrade from the DUR to the Sabre for $45 and keep it in your hangar, and then later spend the money to upgrade to the DUR and then apply that upgrade to the DUR later. I think it's great advice. It helps you to kind of split up payments, and it allows you to almost kind of put a holder on a ship that you may not be able to afford right now. It almost becomes some form of a, layaway in some form or fashion. So I think the Sabre is going to be a great ship, and I think it's probably worth your consideration. But always remember, you can earn everything in-game. If you're even on the fence a little bit, or you're stretched thin for money right now, don't push yourself. Another thing I would expect is probably some Q&A from the devs about this ship, and hopefully they're going to share some more information and thoughts later in the week, and that may end up pushing you one way or the other when it comes to the should you buy portion of this ship. Now, if you have questions about any of this, please let me know and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Otherwise, that's going to be it for now. I appreciate you guys watching. Hope you have a wonderful day and take care.